Part of the, this forum is for Quality Forum and Patient Safety Initiative, and we've also brought up, since all of us are working in the healthcare industry, and there's a national pharmaceutical shortage crisis going on, where people are developing workarounds and having to deal with the patient safety ramifications and the nursing workarounds and a whole bunch of things that affect across the healthcare continuum. So we thought that it would be a good idea to present that as Dr. Belgado is going to present you a PowerPoint presentation as a background, and then we're going to have an expert panelist to address that issue, and we'll have a time for opportunity for questions thereafter. So let me just introduce, first of all, Dr. Belgado is the pharmacy manager for the Division of Therapeutic Policy Management and director of the Drug Information Center at the Department of Pharmacy at Shands, Jacksonville. And with that, I'll give you Dr. Belgado.
Thank you, Dr. Oberman. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk to all of you today. And drug shortages have been a really difficult problem, not just for our hospital at Shands or UF Health, Jacksonville, but across the country. And so what I'm going to try and do today is just show you why we're having them. And it's actually pretty interesting. One of the things that you'll see, and I'm sure all of you have seen, is that drug shortages are in the popular press. Everywhere you read the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times. There are many, many different issues related to shortages, and the lay press is not lacking for all of those issues. But one of the things that I want to be able to show you is that, since 2004, we've seen that drug shortages have increased quite dramatically. And so everybody wonders, well, why is this happening? What are the reasons? And so if you look at this data, this comes straight from the FDA, and the majority of the reasons for drug shortages they indicate are quality reasons, but they really don't drill down to exactly why is it quality. One of the things we talk about at our Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee at Shands is our drug shortages, and many times the physicians will ask, well, why is that short? My short answer is quality, but what we'll see now is it's a little bit more than that. But first, before you can understand why we're having drug shortages, you have to understand the drug supply chain. And so this supply chain is actually directly from the FDA's website, where we try and understand where the drugs come from. So initially we have our suppliers, the raw materials manufacturers, who then provide drug to the manufacturers, who go to repackagers. They repackage them for unit dose. They put barcodes on them. And then ultimately, drugs will go to the wholesalers. After the wholesalers, they'll go to the hospitals and patient care areas, and then ultimately to the patient. But one of the things that they didn't indicate in their drug supply chain is the regulatory and the legislative issues related to drug shortages and the drug supply. And that initially happens at the manufacturer level. Another piece is our group purchasing organizations, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, but also contributes to our drug shortages. So we'll see that all of these different pieces affect it: the raw materials, the manufacturers, the regulatory, the GPOs, and then the hospitals all have a hand in the reason why we have drug shortages. So I want to tell you a story. Back in 2008, I'm sure many of you remember the shortage that we had of heparin. And the reason why we had a shortage of heparin was because there was a recall. They found that many, many people were dying. Renal failure, multi-organ failure, and they found that it was due to this heparin, but they couldn't figure out why. They drilled down. What they found was there was product that was tainted, or actually contaminated, with this chemical called oversulfated chondroitin. And they found that it actually originated from the raw materials plant. One of the things that we learned is that through the FDA, they actually inspect raw materials plants, or they say they inspect raw materials plants once a year. One of the things that they found is that this specific raw materials plant was not inspected. And so what did they find when they went there? This is actually, indulge me for a minute, this came from the New York Times when they were investigating the drug shortages. And this is actually one of the raw materials areas where they process pig intestines to make heparin. And so, one of the things that has happened as a result of this is that the FDA is now making sure that they do these annual inspections of raw materials. So when we look at the reasons for shortages and they say raw materials, it means that they found something in the raw materials plants or sometimes the foreign raw materials plant that prevents that material from coming into the States. The next piece I want to talk about are the manufacturers. And in all of the things that you'll see, and probably what you've already experienced, is most of the raw materials, most of the shortages come from injectable drugs. And so 73% of all drug shortages are injectable drugs. And so why is that? One of the things that we found, it's mostly generic products. And what do we know about generic products? They're cheap, they're inexpensive. I know from a disproportionate share hospital, we pay pennies for some of these injectable drugs. And so if you think about the margin that these manufacturers make to be able to produce drug, it's very narrow. And so what has happened? The quality standards in these manufacturing plants have decreased. They haven't been able to keep up with the updates in their manufacturing. And so we found a few quality issues in these products. Sometimes routine facility maintenance doesn't happen. And then sometimes manufacturers make business decisions not to continue to make drugs. So if they're not making a profit for those drugs, they're going to quit making it. One great example, a couple years ago, we had a shortage of erythromycin ophthalmic ointment. And this particular drug company just decided to quit making it. Fortunately, another company picked it up. But what we found is we couldn't provide our erythromycin ophthalmic ointment to the babies, and we were rationing, we were doing all kinds of things, but it was a business decision when we found out what the real reason was. The other thing that happens is that manufacturers are unable to support the demand. One of the things that I learned in working with drug shortages is that, there are only a few generic drug companies, and so when one drug company gets shut down because of quality issues, the other companies can't keep up the supply. They work on a schedule, and so what I found is that if one company is making, let's say, furosemide, they'll make it based on the market share from the previous year, and so they'll make it in February. And so they'll make all of their furosemide for their market share in February, and then that'll be enough for the next fiscal year. When the other drug company goes short or is shut down, that company can't stop production of another drug to continue making the drug that the other companies made. So it becomes this chain of events where we can't keep up with the demand. The other things that we find is sometimes we see with these quality issues all of these other precipitating issues. Lack of sterility, they found particulates and foreign matter in their product. Sometimes there are impurities or degradation, and then sometimes there's equipment breakdown. Another thing that I learned through this process is that one of the things is the FDA, when they come and look at these plants, if they have to change a gear or if they have to change a process within their machinery, not only do they shut down that machinery, they have to wait for an inspector to come in and re-inspect it before they start. So therefore, there's a delay before we can see more product produced. The next piece is the regulatory issues. And so there are lots of political issues related to this, and Congress actually released a report last year of the reasons why we have drug shortages. And one of the primary things that they indicated, it was because of a new FDA commissioner. And I think, not to fault the commissioner, but I feel that when you're in a new position, you want to do good things, and you want to make sure that things are done properly. So when you look at what's going on, you find that some things we want to clean up. And so what we found is that the letters that went out to manufacturers started to increase. And they increased quite dramatically. And letters related to quality increased from 42% in 2009 up to 156% in 2010. And what ended up happening is there were 4 major generic drug companies that shut down. Within this congressional report, one of the things that they mentioned is that it was very irresponsible to let all 4 manufacturers shut down at the same time, essentially causing panic within the health system, and I'm sure all of you have experienced that. This is a graph that shows the warning letters, and so you'll see from 2009 to 2011, the warning letters spiked. So it was a very difficult time for us. The other thing that happened is enforcement of unapproved drugs, and I'm sure everybody understands the drug laws, where in 1938, our drugs were approved for safety. In 1962, they said that we have to approve drugs for safety and efficacy, but there was a time in between there where some drugs were introduced to the marketplace that only were approved on safety issues. So the FDA came up with this program called the DESI program, the Drug Evaluation and Safety Initiative, that actually did a retrospective review to make sure all of these drugs are safe and effective. But the other piece of this is the grandfathering. The grandfathering drugs that were pre-1938, they were essentially approved. But one of the things that the FDA said is that if these are approved, they have to be exactly the same as they were in 1938. The FDA doesn't keep a list of grandfathered drugs, but what they expect is the manufacturer to be able to provide the FDA with documentation to say that this product has not changed one iota since 1938. And so within that, that means no dosage form changes, no formulation changes, no vial to syringe changes, those kinds of things. And so one of the things that we found, and this is actually from the American Society of Health Systems Pharmacists shortage website, is that we had a problem with emergency drug syringes. And I'm sure all of you have experienced this. And so one of the reasons they said was the reason for this shortage is that this company, Amphastar IMS, they discontinued many of the emergency medicine syringes that we see in our crash carts because they were considered unapproved drugs. So since they're unapproved, the rules are you have to submit a new drug application. And so in lieu of creating a new drug application, performing the studies, they said, you know what, we're just going to quit making it. But in the meantime, this happened in 2010, they've had a change of heart and actually reintroduced some of those emergency syringes. But what you'll see is we had shortages of lidocaine syringes, calcium chloride syringes, sodium bicarb. I'm not telling any of you anything new, but it's been really difficult to manage the crash carts in that sense. The other regulatory issue is the introduction of the Medicaid Modernization Act. And we credit the Medicaid Modernization Act of 2003 to giving us the Medicare benefit. But what it also did is it changed the pricing strategy for drugs. I won't go into the complexities, but essentially it changed from an average wholesale price to an average selling price, which ended up being a significant amount less than what we'd expect. As far as reimbursement goes, on the outpatient side, physicians were seeing less reimbursement. And so what they found was it was directing providers to medications that they would have higher reimbursement costs. Therefore, drug companies that are making generic drugs saw less business for those things. Mostly outpatient drugs and mostly the reasons for our shortage of oncology medications. The other issue is the 340B pricing program. And we know about the 340B program is it provides nominal pricing to disproportionate share hospitals. And along with that and the MMA price reforms, we've seen a decrease in the revenue that drug companies are making. So it turned into an unintended consequence. But what you're seeing is many of this is just all economic. The other thing that's also related to the economics are the GPOs, or the group purchasing organizations. And I relate this to buying groups and shops that we know as Costco or Sam's or those kinds of things. So quantity and cost savings in numbers. So if you're a member of this GPO, the GPO will negotiate costs for your medications, and so the generic companies are pushing to lower costs for their medications. And so, I'm sorry, I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to run through this really quickly. The last thing is the health systems. The health systems find that we only keep 30 days or 2 weeks of supply in the hospital. And so when drug shortages occur, you find that we don't have enough drug to last for 2 weeks. Or for 30 days. So we're trying to find other ways to maintain our drug supply. Sometimes hoarding and stockpiling will happen. And I'm sure none of us have been guilty of hoarding or stockpiling, but it does happen sometimes. But what I wanted to show again is the reasons for drug shortages. You see Medicaid modernization that happened in the early 2000s, the unapproved drug initiatives, the heparin recall, and the new FDA commissioner. And all of that contributed to the increase in drug shortages. But one of the things you'll find is that there are some solutions that have happened too. The FDA has allowed a temporary importation of foreign equivalents. So we've seen some propofol come from the UK and phenylephrine. We've seen sodium bicarb come from Australia. And then we've also seen the FDA allow products that had some quality issues. Most recently, Altaplace. It was recalled because there were some rubber particulate matter within the product, but subsequently they allowed release of that product as long as it's filtered. Sodium phosphate is another product that we're filtering. We actually require double filtering for that, but they will allow some products with problems. And so the last thing I wanted to show were the legislation that happened with the FDA Safety and Innovation Act. And so there was an executive order last year by President Obama that said there needs to be increased communication between drug companies so you can talk to each other, that you can increase management of your medications if other companies are short. There have actually been more legislation that was passed last year where there's more communication, expedited review of generics, and so forth. And so I want to show again the increase in shortages, but you'll see with the executive presidential order and then the regulations that were passed, we're seeing drug shortages decrease. But what's happened is that our active drug shortages are remaining the same. So it continues to be a challenge. There's lots of quality issues that are related to this and lots of challenges from a pharmacy standpoint to take care of these things, and hopefully we'll be able to address those today.
Thank you, Dr. Belgado.